Hi, I'm here writing the script for Dark Side of Seoul, Weird Tales from Korean Lore, and I'm taking a little break here, and I'm thinking back on the comics, the horror comics that really inspired me to become a writer of comics myself, particularly of horror comics. When I was a kid in the 80s, I was reading comics quite often, and a lot of the comics I had were horror comics, but they were, they're kind of the standard fare at the time. Things like this, The Tomb of Dracula and Frankenstein, stuff like that. All things that were mostly, titles I were reading were mostly from Marvel Comics. A little bit later, probably sometime in the, late 80s, I discovered DC's horror comics, and I thought they were much better. Things like The House of Secrets and Unexpected, that's classic stuff. And yeah, Ghosts. This is one of my favorite comic book covers of all time. I just love it. It's a beautiful cover. So these are the horror comics that I was really enjoying when I was quite young in the 80s, and first just kind of reading comics. Then when I was about 10 years old, in 1980, I went to an antique shop with my parents, and we'd often go to these antique shops in a little town that we'd visit on Sunday afternoons. So on this one particular day, we went into an antique shop, and I asked the owner of the shop if he had any comics and where they were, and he told me that they were upstairs. So I bolted up the steps, and I remember the stairs they looked old. They looked quite old, very imposing, very creepy, very gothic. And I had to go up the steps. I got to a platform. I had to turn around and go up another smaller flight of steps, and that brought me up into the attic. And when I got up there at the top step, I realized how creepy the place was. It really frightened me. It was scary. It was a scary place. It was the quintessential idea of a haunted attic, and it frightened me. And then, of course, the comics were right on the back wall, so I had to walk through the attic to get to them. So, but I didn't walk. I probably ran. And when I got there, I got to the rack. I found this: Forbidden Worlds, number 47, cover date October 1956. I grabbed it, brought it down to my father, and I said, I want to buy it. Can you buy it for me, please? It was $8. Now, my dad wasn't too keen on spending $8 on a comic. Now, in the late 80s, early 90s, comics were nowhere near $8. So he told me that if I wanted the comic, I would have to give up my fudge. Now, we used to go to these, in this town, they'd have some shops, and they had really good, like, classic fudge. And I used to really like getting some. So he said, if, you can't have both, so choose what you want. And so I chose the comic. So we brought it home. I read it. My father read it. We both really enjoyed it. And then we talked about how much we really enjoyed it. Now, the following week or two later, we went to a comic book dealer. Now, this guy wasn't in a shop, a comic book shop. He was set up in a mall, and he had hundreds of comics, and in long boxes. And he would also price comics. So we brought Forbidden Worlds to him, and we asked him, my father asked him, how much is it worth? How much would you pay for it? Just to get an idea. And the dealer, looked at it and said, I will give you $80 cash for it right now. Now, my father was probably thinking, I paid $8 for it, and you're going to give me 80. But my father said to him, it's not mine. So then my dad looked at me and he said, what do you want to do? Now, the first thing that struck me that I remember is that, how many comics can I buy for $80? So yeah, I was pretty excited about that. But it was also probably the first time I was given any kind of financial decision. And then I started to think about how much I really enjoyed the comic, and how much my father enjoyed it, and how much we enjoyed talking about it, how much we enjoyed sharing it. So I thought for a bit, looked at the dealer, and I said, I'm not going to sell it. And I still have it today. It's probably one of the key issues in my collection. And this comic is the beginning of my real deep love for the horror genre in the comic book medium. And not only that, this was a springboard onto science fiction comics and other just generally weird fiction comic books. So then, about a year after I bought Forbidden Worlds, or my dad bought Forbidden Worlds for me, I found this. The reprints of EC Comics' horror line from the 1950s. I bought it, I read it, and then that was it. I was completely hooked. I fell in love with horror comics and the genre itself, and that was it. I started looking for horror comics, and then to actively collect them so I could have a library of comics. And then I went all the way through looking for EC Comics and all the other reprints and whatnot, and of course the other Tales from the Crypt. And then just look at that. That's a classic cover, that one there. Love it. And then of course the Haunt of Fear. Classic stuff. Love these too. And then one of my favorite, probably my top 3 favorite comic book covers of all time, is from the Vault of Horror. Just love it. It's a classic cover. And then I started going back through other comic book publishers, finding some of their own things, like Charlton Comics, and they had things like The Many Ghosts of Dr. Graves, this classic stuff, and Ghostly Tales, this great horror comics, older horror comics. And then I found Gold Key. I think by the time I started buying and reading Gold Key, they were already maybe out of print, with things like Boris Karloff, Tales of Mystery, just a classic stuff, and of course, yeah, Grimm's Ghost Stories. So that's just a little history on how I got into horror comics, and how they really led me towards a love of the genre through most mediums. And as I'm writing Tales from, writing Tales from the Crypt, I wish. As I'm writing Dark Side of Seoul, Weird Tales from Korean Lore, these are the comics that are really in the back of my head that are inspiring me. And other than the ghastly Korean folklore that's going to make up the main anthology stories of the comic itself. So as I'm writing the comic, I'm trying to keep to the tradition of these comics that really inspired me and were really seminal to my childhood, and to, of course, to the comics medium itself. So I'll try to give you a product that's, even if it's half as good as these, then I'll be successful. And on that, cheers.